Well, I mean, for me, the thing that's exciting about education reporters, I mean, they're the one beat that really is out in the neighborhoods, and they're there reporting, I think, on the most critical and essential public institution there is. It's an institution that everybody believes in some ways. I mean, they believe in the transcendence of transformative powers of education. And so I feel like, given that education reporters are out there, they're sort of witnessing what's going on in these communities, it's incumbent on them to sort of step out beyond the school building and sort of recognize what's going on in the streets and in the families of the kids in these schools. They really are in this kind of unusual place. And maybe I naively believe in the power of narrative, but I do believe that narrative or storytelling, it does have the ability to transform the way we view the world and view ourselves. And so I think it's incumbent on us to go out and try to tell stories. Yeah. But stories, I got to be clear, I mean, that stories are that are honest to what we see and what we hear, and sometimes they can be complicated, they can be discomforting, they can be unsettling, but I feel like that's sort of our place.
Right. You've written a lot about poverty, violence, education, sort of. I'm curious, do you think that education is a different kind of argument? I mean, the arguments that happen in the education space, are they different than the arguments that happen in the poverty space and the violence space? I mean, sort of the public policy debates. Are they the same kinds of arguments, or are they different kinds of arguments?
Well, I think, you know, education reform is so incredibly complicated. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. I mean, you look at all the things that we're wrestling with now, you know, small schools, merit pay, incentives for students. You know, you could go standardized testing versus no standardized testing. You could go on and on. And so I feel like for me, if I were an education reporter, one of the real challenges would be is to be able to sort out all the research and what really feels genuine and what doesn't, what we know and what we don't know. And certainly that's the case with other issues as well. I think the thing that's critical about the schools, it is such an essential institution. And despite all the other things I've mentioned, the violence, the issues at home, the drugs, I would argue that the most important place that we've got to put our resources and put our time is in the schools. I mean, I think that's, I mean, again, it's a place that has the potential to be transformative in people's lives.
Right. Do you think, I mean, someone here said that people were tweeting from the luncheon today, and when you mentioned that, you know, you can have the best teachers and the best curriculum, but you still need to deal with these other issues. Folks tweeted that out, and immediately it was being retweeted and retweeted, because there's lots of debates now about, you know what, we can't worry about what's going on outside. The only thing we can deal with is best teachers. That's the thing we're going to focus on. Do you think that's just totally missing the...
Well, I do think it's missing the boat, but I will say this. I mean, I feel like it's not the role of... I mean, it may be a role of Arne Duncan to talk, for example, to talk about these issues. I feel like, you know, as administrators, as teachers, that we've got to give them room to completely focus on school itself. And what I'm suggesting is not that they need to be out in the community and sort of wrestling with these issues, but that we've got to figure out a way to tangle with these issues as well, because otherwise we're going to make their lives incredibly more difficult, if not impossible.
Right.
And so I guess what I'm suggesting is not that they should be out there wrestling with these issues, but rather that we need to find a way to wrestle with these issues while we're also grappling in a very serious way in these recent years with school reform.
Right. And I think Arne Duncan would probably agree. I mean, he's a big fan of community schools. And I want to talk about your new film, but before that, I'm wondering if you could maybe just if you were an education reporter, what would be like the two stories that you would tell right now? I mean, I mean, that's putting you on the spot, but what do you see as like not covered and relatively easy to cover? Right.
Well, one story I feel is an important story to tell, and you and I were talking a little bit about this earlier, is there's a lot, you hear of these instances of school by school around the country, of these incredibly successful schools with these high rates of kids going off to college. These kids are celebrated. They're celebrated within the school. They're celebrated in their neighborhoods and their communities. And I think the real question in the end is how they fare outside, how they fare when they get off to college. Are we really adequately preparing them? I remember many years ago I had done a story for the New York Times Magazine about these 5 kids who were at this DuSable High School, this inner city school in the south side of Chicago, and they were the best and the brightest in their class. They were the ones filled with their own personal aspiration. They also kind of carried the aspiration of their community. They were kind of heroes within that school building, and so I was curious what had happened to them. I kind of caught up with this story 5 years after they graduated. And it was a really, I mean, for me, it was a real eye-opening experience. You know, a couple of them were incredibly successful. One of them sadly committed suicide. And the two who were the best and the brightest, who were first and second or first and third in their class, went to University of Illinois. They both dropped out within their freshman year. They both dropped out because, one, they felt ill-prepared. They realized when they got there that they just simply could not compete with other students there. And then for one of them in particular, he had all these pressures going on at home. His mother was really struggling, and he felt a responsibility, if not obligation, to move back home with her.
That's fascinating. Did you expect that they were all going to be okay, or what did you?
No, I didn't know what I was going to find, but I guess if I had to pick, those were the two that I would have thought would have been real successful. They got these full scholarships to U of I. They, you know, they were just they were on their way. And interestingly enough, the other two went to an all-black college, traditionally black college, Alcorn State in Mississippi, and one of them's a teacher and one of them's a principal now.
Wow,
and I think what for them made the difference, which I think was a real lesson for me, is that they had a guidance counselor at the school, Otis Richardson, who kind of embraced these 5 kids. He got them all on the debate team together, and Otis stayed with those 2 kids. Those 2 kids, in part because they leaned on him. They kind of needed him more than the other 2 did.
Right.
And so Otis even drove them off to college.
Wow.
And,
Wow, that's fascinating.